yesterday, or maybe just last time on A Push, December 7th, 1941, in a date that will forever after live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. And that opens the gateway um, for America's entry to the Second World War. Because remember, Japan declares war on the United States, and Germany, in a sign of solidarity with its ally, Germany's just trying to be a friend, right? Like it was to Austria back in World War One. Germany decides to declare war on the United States too. And Japan, for its part, leaves Germany hanging. Japan does not declare war on Germany's arch rival, the Soviet Union. On the one hand, the United States is much more prepared for the Second World War than it was in the First World War. Franklin Delano Roosevelt has already started the process of mobilizing and preparing the country, the economy, and the military for war. On the other hand, though, there's going to be much more that's expected of the United States. When the United States enters World War One in 1917, the German army had barely advanced beyond the German borders. It was still a stalemate at the front. Well, now the United States is not only going to have to help European nations like France and the like. The United States is going to have to assume the role of liberator of much of Western Europe. Oh, and by the way, also while fighting a large war with Japan on the other side of the world in the Pacific. So what this means is that now more than ever before, the home front becomes important for the war effort, but not just for the United States. The home front in the United States not only becomes essential to America's war effort, but the war effort of the rest of the world, because the United States becomes the arsenal of democracy. And actually, not just an arsenal of democracy, an arsenal of the non-democracies as well, an arsenal of all nations that are willing to take up arms against Germany, Japan, and Italy, the Axis powers. And that begins even before the United States goes to war, or rather, before the United States is attacked by Japan. So what happened, remember, is that in the mid-1930s, Congress passes a series of neutrality acts, which prevented Americans from participating in overseas conflicts. This, by the way, included conflicts in Europe, like the Spanish Civil War, a civil war between fascist and basically communist and socialist elements in Spain. What happens, though, is that when war breaks out in Europe in 1939, the United States starts cozying up to the Allied powers in kind of a subtle way. The neutrality acts are gradually repealed, and instead there's this policy of cash and carry. The idea being that if European powers, ergo Britain and France, can transport military equipment on their own ships, and if they purchase that equipment, then the United States would be willing to kind of support their war effort. But cash and carry is still kind of a passive approach. I mean, arguably, the United States had the same basic approach to European powers during the First World War. The United States wasn't going to intervene politically, but it would still trade with European nations. But because Britain depended so much on overseas trade, that economic relationship between the United States and Britain was essential in World War One, and it was essential in World War Two. Some of you, or hopefully all of you, may remember that Germany's solution to that problem, the problem of America's close economic relationship with Britain, was to attack that trade covertly with a U-boat campaign, an unrestricted submarine warfare campaign. And I told you how there was this tendency in the German military to repeat some of the same basic strategies that they employed in World War One, and they do the same thing in World War Two. They actually use U-boats on an even greater scale than they use in the First World War. And what's also kind of interesting is that just like in the First World War, this is one of the factors that kind of propels America towards a closer relationship with the Allied powers. An American destroyer, the USS Reuben James, was actually torpedoed off the coast of Iceland by German submarines in October of 1941, just a couple of months before Japan attacks America at Pearl Harbor. But remember, this is also in the context of the enactment of Lend-Lease. This is when the focus is less on economics and trade and more on containing Hitler and fascism. This is when the United States starts lending military equipment, and also food and other essential items, but military equipment to specifically Great Britain, but eventually the Soviet Union as well. And this is what kind of leads the United States to be coined the arsenal of democracy. Whether you're looking at U.S. tanks or planes or jeeps, American military equipment was used by all sides. Spoiler, when the Soviet Union captures Berlin in 1945, many Soviet troops move into the city on trucks and jeeps supplied by General Motors. And the term arsenal of democracy actually comes from Franklin Delano Roosevelt in one of his fireside chats. But it's also interesting to note that the United States not only becomes the arsenal of democracies, but also non-democracies. I mean, if there's anything that the United States really provided in World War II, it was sheer industrial muscle. There's this quip or saying I guess the history of history of World War II, the World War II historiography, that goes something like this: World War II was won by Soviet blood, British intelligence, military intelligence, and American steel, American industry. And just like all pithy statements, it's not totally accurate, but it hits on something that, and we'll kind of talk about, the whole British military intelligence angle as well. I think Soviet blood and American steel makes a little bit more sense, but the United States has already kind of positioned itself as being the arsenal of democracy, which means that the home front, again, is going to be more important than ever before. And just to give you guys an idea of the scale of America's war effort, you have over 16 million people serving in the U.S. military in World War II. And to be honest, that's just the tip of the iceberg. If the United States was really pushed, there were other reserves of manpower that it could dip into. And the same, by the way, could not be said for either the Soviet Union or the United Kingdom. You might remember that in World War I, I'm going to mention that a lot, by the way, in this lesson, the formula, the recipe for success was that you paid for the war effort with taxes and bonds, and you also try to streamline both war industries and labor unions. And by the way, you're going to see all of those things repeat in the Second World War, just on a broader scale. You have the War Production Board. This is where the U.S. government, in some cases, helps consolidate different industries, merges a lot of different businesses to streamline the wartime economy. And what is really interesting is that you have companies, again, like General Motors and Ford, these companies that were hit really hard by the Great Depression. Because remember, part of the Depression is, wrapped up in America's over-reliance on the automotive industry. But anyway, you see companies like Ford and General Motors basically retool their assembly lines from cars to tanks or planes. And the same process kind of extends across the country. Basically, consumer good production goes to a standstill. And instead, everything is focused on wartime production. And one of the things that happens is that this kind of solves the problem of the Great Depression. If you're talking about sending 16 million people overseas and filling jobs and actually needing to create new jobs, well, then that solves the employment problem of the Great Depression. What also kind of happens is that because consumer good production grinds to a halt because nobody or no company is making them, Americans really don't have a lot of different things they could really buy other than food and basic necessities. So what this also means is that Americans are going back to work. They're also working long hours because of the fact there's a war going on, and they don't have very much they can spend money on. So for Americans, at least on an economic level, we'll touch on this a little bit more in just a bit. World War II was economically beneficial. I mean, you hate to say that about any war, and I'm not saying that war is good, but at least for the American experience, if you look at per capita incomes, if you look at people's bank accounts, you see large increases there. So, I mean, just look at this, a 250% increase in manufacturing volume. And by the end of the war, the United States experiences an 800% increase in production. So in other words, in just a few years of war, we make up for the losses of the Great Depression and then some. But that being said, one of the interesting things that you see is some pushback with this mobilization. Because what also happens is that Roosevelt does everything that he can to make sure that wartime production continues without hindrance, without any disturbances. Well, remember that those disturbances could be caused by labor unions. And if you remember, Roosevelt's New Deal coalition relied upon labor unions and African Americans and Southern Democrats, right? And labor union voters were very loyal and very reliable. And one of the things that you see is that as workers were expected to work longer hours and, let's say, in difficult conditions, you see some pushback. John L. Lewis, who is the leader of the United Mine Workers, decides to call a strike in, I think, 1942. And one of the interesting things about that is that Lewis was actually a close supporter of FDR in the late 1930s. Campaigns for the guy's re-election. But as FDR starts leading the United States towards a confrontation with Germany, Japan, and Italy, John Lewis, like many Americans, isn't feeling that. He's part of the isolationist faction that kind of dies down in politics and in public life after Pearl Harbor, but doesn't go completely away. And what happens is that there's actually a pretty significant strike that Lewis and the United Mine Workers basically set off. And Congress gives FDR the authorization to nationalize factories if necessary. In other words, go around labor unions and basically, have the government take over entire businesses. And what's kind of again, interesting about that is just a few years ago, Americans were calling FDR a radical for just daring to intervene in businesses. With the NRA and other kinds of policies. Well, now, especially after Pearl Harbor, Americans are much more willing to give Roosevelt that that type of authority. So the United States economy expands quite a bit during the Second World War because of the wartime production boom. Uh, the question, though, is, well, who's paying for all this? And the answer is all of us, or at least all of our grandparents, great grandparents, great great grandparents, in the form of taxes. But also, just like in World War One, you see this emphasis on war bonds which raised over $100 billion, by the way, during a time period where $100 billion went a lot further. Um, but just to kind of give you an idea of the sheer scale of the financing that was required to fund this boom in production, um, during the First World War, the highest marginal tax rates were capped at about 77%, which is still, by the way, really high. But that's nothing in comparison to World War II. Um, if you look at World War II, um, the highest marginal tax rates peaked in the mid 1940s, I think around 1943 to 1944, at 95%, which meant that if you were in that top tax bracket, 95 cents out of every dollar that you made was given to the federal government in tax. It's almost unimaginable that this could happen in today's time. But again, it's a very different culture because the United States has come through the Great Depression. There's this sort of great coming together in the aftermath of Pearl Harbor. And one of the things we also see about World War II is that if you remember that battle cry during the American Civil War, rich man's war, poor man's fight, you really can't say that about World War II. It's a war in which American armies weren't entirely made up of 17, 18, and 19-year-olds. Like the average age of combat troops during the Second World War was something like 25, 26, as opposed to like 19 or 20 in World War I. It was an older army. It was a more middle-class army. And it was a war in which anybody or everybody who was anybody was expected to pitch in. All the Hollywood stars of the 1950s, if you look at their Wikipedia pages, or yeah, I guess it would be Wikipedia. IMDb doesn't really have like military stunts, but anyway, almost all of them participated in the war effort. I mean, Disney gets mobilized for the war effort. I think Chuck Jones, one of the leading artists of the Looney Tunes cartoons, is mobilized for the war. Hollywood in general is mobilized for the war effort. So it is this war in which everybody is connected to the war effort in some way, shape, or form. But look at this, though. It peaks around 95%, but it doesn't really decrease anytime soon. In fact, it's only in the 1960s that you really see significant changes in the highest marginal tax rates. But that's another story. Point being is that bonds and taxes are just as, if not more, essential because now the United States is not only having to fund its own war effort, but the war effort of the rest of the world. And just like in the First World War, it's also important that you give everybody some feeling like they can contribute. You have this campaign to encourage people to grow their own fruits and vegetables to basically ensure that there would be enough food for troops at the front and food to give as aid. And of course, you can't just call these things gardens, right? Because every term, every word in the Second World War has to involve the war effort in some way, shape, or form. So you call them victory gardens. So keep farming those tomatoes or those pumpkins, and you can beat back Jerry, as he was called. That's kind of a slang term for the Germans during the Second World War. But one of the other patterns that we see in World War II, that we saw in World War One, the Civil War, the American Revolution, is that when the United States goes to war in a big war, it has to mobilize groups that are marginalized. And in World War II, we see that very same pattern play out. Just like in the First World War, women become essential for the war effort. And just proportionally, women become actually more essential for the Second World War than they were for the First. And that's just because World War II was a longer war, and the scale of World War II is just much greater than the First World War. Over 6 million women work outside the home. And they're not just, and by the way, I mean, remember what that means for the idea of the cult of domesticity, the idea that women are supposed to stay in the home and raise children. Not only are they working outside the home, but they're working in many cases in the armaments industry. There's actually a show, I haven't really watched it, shame on me, about women factory workers in World War II who manufacture bombs in factories. And the thing is those depictions of women participating in the war industry give rise to the image of Rosie the Riveter. And by the way, you can tell by her posture and pose, Rosie the Riveter is somebody who's basically challenging the idea of the cult of domesticity to an arm wrestling contest, because she is very feminine, but doesn't necessarily embody traditional female characteristics based upon the cult of domesticity. She's very muscular. She's wearing, a work jumpsuit. And the image of Rosie the Riveter, and by the way, many individuals kind of take claim for being the inspiration for Rosie the Riveter. But the image of Rosie the Riveter was certainly based on a large number of real people. This is somebody who's kind of inspired by the image of Rosie the Riveter. And she's actually working on, I think it's supposed to be an A-9 Vengeance bomber. I mean, if women are supposed to take on nurturing roles in the household, how can they also, manufacture bombs that are supposed to fly over cities and basically blast them? But what is kind of interesting, and this is kind of an epilogue for this, is that during the 1950s, you see kind of a resurgence of the cult of domesticity, the idea that women are supposed to take on a much more domestic role. Now, I should also point out that women don't just join basically the war industry. They also join the war effort. They basically join the military. Over 200,000 women serve in the military in some capacity during the Second World War. Now, one of the things that has always been a problem for women in wartime is that they go and get decent paying jobs in wartime, but as soon as the war is over, what happens? That's right, or I'm hoping that's right. Basically, in the Civil War, in World War I, and even during the American Revolution, women are displaced from their roles, either in the workforce or on the family farm, and basically have to go back to a domestic role. And that's always been kind of a difficult crisis that has to be managed after wartime. And the United States has never really managed that problem well. Well, after the Second World War, there's almost like a last little bit of New Deal that's ratified by Congress. It's the GI Bill. The GI Bill provides unemployment benefits for veterans. It grants low interest loans for housing, but just as important, it provides tuition assistance. So basically, American veterans coming home from Europe and East Asia can go back to school on Uncle Sam's dime. So, in other words, they don't want to go back and get jobs in factories. Many of the servicemen who are coming home decide to go back to school and get better jobs. Now, it's not a perfect solution, but it's a much better solution than what existed during the previous big wars of American history. And one of the things you kind of see is that back in the Progressive era, Charlotte Perkins Gilman wrote the work Women in Economics. And basically, the argument she made is the fact that women will eventually gain equality by virtue of their economic power, economic significance. And we kind of saw that play out in World War One, and we also saw that play out in World War Two. That being said, by the way, here's another picture of women industrial workers during World War II. If you look at the Germans, one of the interesting things is that if you look at the industrial capacity of the United States and compare it to Germany, there's no contest. The United States basically outproduces Germany by an order of magnitude. The thing is that in a total war, you've got to mobilize all your resources. The United States, in actual fact, was under less pressure to do that. The United States was never directly threatened by invasion or anything. I mean, basically the closest thing that happened is that the Japanese bombed us at Pearl Harbor. They briefly occupied the Aleutian Islands in Alaska. We invaded the Aleutian Islands, but then once we got there, we realized that the Japanese had hightailed it out of there because it was cold. And by the way, the Japanese decided to bomb us with balloon bombs that actually managed to kill two people in the Pacific Northwest. So that's the extent of the war that the United States saw on its own soil. So the United States didn't have the same pressure that Germany or the Soviet Union had to completely mobilize its economy and mobilize its population for war. But it still more or less did. If you compare that to Germany, if you look at German factories, up until the very end of the war, almost all German factories were staffed predominantly by men. And just like we talked about with the Confederate States during the Civil War, Germany and the Confederacy lost the war because of their own ideology. In the sense that Germany, and let's say that the Nazis, they had this very traditional, paternalistic attitude towards women and thought that men should assume the burden of wartime production. And they don't really mobilize women, let's say, nearly to the extent that the other countries, including the United States, do. Let's talk about the beginning of the Civil Rights era, because the story of the Civil Rights movement that begins in the 1950s and 1960s comes about as a consequence of wartime mobilization. So, a little bit more context. You hopefully remember that in 1894, there's a court case, Plessy versus Ferguson, that essentially upholds racial segregation as constitutional. That separation of people by race is constitutional so long as it's done on an equal basis, whatever that means. Well, what happens is that you see the expansion of Jim Crow laws beyond the South, throughout the Midwest. And what also happens is that the federal government itself, the same federal government that waged a war against slavery during the Civil War, adopts some of these Jim Crow laws. The United States Army that goes to war in World War II was a Jim Crow army. And what I mean by that is that African Americans were segregated into racially exclusive combat units. And by the way, not just African Americans, but for example, there were Japanese Americans who were also segregated into their own combat units. But in other words, the Second World War was a war that enshrined racial segregation. And what happens is that a guy by the name of A. Philip Randolph, who was the founder of the first labor union for African Americans, decides to march on Washington. By the way, note that I didn't say Martin Luther King. Before Martin Luther King marches on Washington, you have A. Philip Randolph's March on Washington. And in fact, the famous March on Washington in 1963 wasn't organized by King. It was organized by this guy. Randolph invites King to give a speech at the march, but both marches on Washington, the one in 1941, 1942 maybe, I'll need to double check that, but the one in 1942 and the one in 1963 are both organized by this guy. At this point, Randolph isn't even trying to go after state-based discrimination. He's, I guess, enough of a realist or a cynic, or too much of a cynic to do that. What he is upset about is the fact that the federal government does business with industries and organizations that openly endorse racial discrimination. In other words, that use discriminatory practices. And so Randolph marches on Washington, and interestingly, he meets with Eleanor Roosevelt, Franklin Delano Roosevelt's wife, and kind of gets his support. And this is partially because Franklin Delano Roosevelt had kind of a mixed track record on civil rights, but Eleanor Roosevelt was considered more progressive. So Eleanor goes out and meets with Randolph, and his March on Washington, which is attended by thousands of people, puts enough pressure on Franklin Delano Roosevelt to issue Executive Order 8802 in 1941. In 8802, Franklin Delano Roosevelt bans discrimination in the federal government, in the federal civil service. And he also mandates that any industry doing business with the federal government in World War II, and basically all of them were, had to ban racially discriminatory practices in the workplace. So it's not exactly the Voting Rights Act or the Civil Rights Act of 1964, but it's still an important stepping stone. We'll also talk about a few more important stepping stones for civil rights during the course of the Second World War. But one of the things that happens across the world, actually, is you see profound labor shortages caused by the war itself. And so you might remember that during the Great Depression, recent immigrants to the United States, especially from Latin America, were actually being deported because there were no available jobs. What happens, though, is that during the Second World War, that process is reversed. The United States government can't get enough labor. And so President Franklin Delano Roosevelt actually starts a program with Mexico to basically create labor contracts so that it would basically Latino Americans, specifically from Mexico, could immigrate in large numbers um, to the United States, specifically, by the way, in the West Coast. And we'll talk a little bit more about why the West Coast specifically. But what also happens is that this influx of Latino Americans into the American Southwest causes racial tensions. In the 1940s, you actually have a riot between Latino Americans in the city of Los Angeles and American sailors called the Zoot Suit riots, in which dozens of people, hundreds of people actually, are injured after American sailors start assaulting Latino Americans. So, speaking of some of these racial tensions, just like during the First World War, the United States actually interns many of its own citizens in camps. But you might remember that during the First World War, that practice was typically reserved for Germans, and of course, you had political radicals who were sort of arrested without cause as well. Um, During the Second World War, though, what's kind of interesting is that if you listen to what FDR says in most of his speeches, he doesn't usually label Germany as the enemy. The enemy is Nazism. As if Nazism is kind of like this brain fungus that warps the minds of the German people. So what's kind of interesting is that despite how easy it would have been to vilify the German people and German culture, that doesn't really happen in the Second World War, at least in the United States. For the Soviet Union, by the way, that's a totally different answer. But this is a political conflict, an ideological conflict, not a conflict based upon nationalism, based upon the fact that we're Americans and the Germans are Germans. The conflict between the United States and Japan is very different. And partially that's because of the fact that Japan attacked first. It bombed Pearl Harbor without pretext or without a timely declaration of war. But also there was some, let's say, some racial animus behind it. And so Japanese Americans were vilified after the beginning of the Second World War. And so what Roosevelt actually does, and this is, in some respects, if there's anything that Roosevelt does, besides cheat on Eleanor, that historians have a hard time defending, it's this right here, Executive Order 9066. We talked about another executive order that basically ends discrimination in the federal civil service, the federal government. This is a very different type of executive order because it authorizes the removal of enemy aliens from military areas. And one thing that's important to remember is that Japanese Americans, because of the fact that they had to cross the Pacific to immigrate to the United States, tended to live on the West Coast, in California specifically. And California during the Second World War was basically one big, gigantic military base for the most part. And so if you're talking about evacuating people from military areas, you're talking about a huge number. So what happens is that over 110,000 American citizens were removed and placed in internment camps. And what happens, by the way, I should also back up and say, just like in the First World War, the purpose of these internment camps is not to kill people per se, or kill people by intent, but it happened. It happened because when Japanese Americans were corralled into internment camps, the federal government, let's say, just didn't really prioritize proper sanitation, living standards, food. And so over 1,800 people die in these camps. And some died just because of, just casual cruelty. Guards shooting at people just because they were approached too close to the fence here. Um, so the question is, um, you know, I know that we talked about the fact that Plessy versus Ferguson says that it's okay to discriminate uh, based upon race, as long as that discrimination is visited equally on whites and non-whites. But I don't think that you can argue that this is separate but equal. This is, plainly not equal. So what happens is that Frank Korematsu, a Japanese American, does the classic American thing of, that's right, they sue the federal government in the Korematsu versus United States case. The Korematsu case is almost a throwback to the cases that were litigated during the First World War over the Alien and Sedition Act. Actually, there are a lot of parallels here to a certain extent. So what happens is that Frank Korematsu sues the government because he is arrested for resisting this executive order. And what happens in the year 1944, near at the tail end of the Second World War? The Supreme Court decides 6-3 that the need to protect against espionage, even espionage by United States citizens, outweighs individual rights, including the rights of American citizens. And Korematsu is one of these cases, like Dred Scott. It's never affirmatively overruled by the Supreme Court. The United States has apologized to it. I think President Clinton eventually apologizes for the treatment of Japanese Americans during the Second World War. But, the Supreme Court, this ruling handed down by the Supreme Court is never overturned. That being said, what is interesting is that Japanese Americans were generally enthusiastic volunteers in many respects for military service in World War II. This is a picture of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, called the Nisei Regiment. This is basically a regiment of all Japanese Americans. And this is them posing with a captured Nazi battle flag at the Battle of Monte Cassino. The 442nd Nisei Regiment was the most decorated combat unit in World War II. And when you needed to break a hole in the enemy lines, the Nisei Regiment would certainly oblige. And you have to remember that it's kind of like a throwback to the Civil War, where African Americans, despite expectations, demonstrated a remarkable degree of steadiness and reliability. And they wouldn't run away because they knew what the stakes were, and they also wanted to prove something. And the same is true for Japanese Americans during the Second World War. Now, I mentioned that there are some enormous demographic changes. And if you actually take a step back and look at the country as a whole, you also see some remarkable changes in where people live. The war itself stimulates the growth of the West Coast, and we talked about the fact that during the darkest days of the Great Depression, the West Coast was the only part of the country that wasn't absolutely horrible, in which you didn't have massive layoffs, just small baby layoffs. 1 in 9 people move because of the war. And if you think about that, I mean, this is during a time period before you have interstate highways. This is during a time in which it's, definitely expensive to move, and it's still in the aftermath of the Great Depression. But you have over 10% of the population moving during the war because of the war. Where are they moving? Well, they're moving to these areas. They're moving to an area called the Sun Belt. Um, because what starts to happen is that factories in the north are kind of expensive because areas like New York City and Detroit, Boston, these are expensive places to live. And so industries start relocating to areas in the South where the cost of living is cheaper. So, what this starts is this really historic process. Because remember, one of the goals in Reconstruction was to force the South to transition away from a cash crop economy, to start building factories rather than plantations. And remember, that vision, that goal, fell flat. But because of the Second World War, the American South starts industrializing. And this also begins a very different process, though, in the United States. The Second World War is won in part because of American industrial might. But what this also starts to show is this process that we call outsourcing, of companies and factories seeking out cheaper places to do business. First, that's the American South, but then other places like Mexico, China, Taiwan, etc. So we see the process of deindustrialization. Interestingly, during a time period where industrialization is at its peak in the United States during the Second World War. And this process continues after the Second World War, during the Cold War. But again, if you're looking at the story of the American West, you can't explain the settlement and the growth of states like California without talking about the massive changes that occur during the Second World War. Now, I'm not able to dwell on this point as much as it deserves, but we do have to talk about the Holocaust. And it's something that I should hope most of you guys know quite a bit about. During the Second World War, the United States has a very different experience with concentration camps. And these are the concentration camps that US, British, and Soviet forces discover in Germany during the end of the war. These are not concentration camps that have been established to quarantine, let's say, an unwanted part of the population. These are concentration camps that have been set up for either slave labor or, in other cases, for the purpose of exterminating people, either through gas or by simply starving them to death. And in many cases, the difference between work camps and death camps became academic because there was still a lot of death going around. As most of you know, Adolf Hitler comes to power based upon the fact that he blames Jews, socialists, and Slavs, well, actually more Jews and socialists, actually, for Germany's defeat during the First World War. And what's really shocking to me is that, everybody is aware that Hitler is an anti-Semite. Especially when you look at events like Kristallnacht, in which members of Hitler's secret police, the brown shirts, basically go and vandalize Jewish businesses and synagogues and kill a few hundred Jewish people. I mean, everybody knew that Hitler was an anti-Semite. That was public knowledge for the first part. And yet, people were still absolutely shocked that over 6 million Jews and 9 million people in total, including homosexuals, gypsies, and Slavs, and political prisoners, were killed during the Holocaust. And we're not just talking about ordinary people, people on the street who were surprised. This is actually a photograph of the senior American military commanders. Dwight David Eisenhower, Omar Bradley, and everybody's favorite George Patton at one of the death camps. I think it might be Auschwitz, but I'm not sure. And even these guys who were in positions of power and authority and knew what was going on were absolutely shocked that Germany was exterminating millions of people. By the way, including millions of its own citizens or its former citizens. And maybe that's just because the idea that Germany would devote so many of its, dwindling resources to exterminate a portion of its own population and the population of other countries during a war just seemed bizarre. And maybe it's for that reason that American military authorities like Eisenhower took careful pains to document everything they saw in these death camps. Because as Eisenhower puts it, and I'm going to paraphrase it, future generations might doubt as to whether or not this could actually happen. And by the way, he was tragically right there. But this is obviously a very important moment in both world history and U.S. history, because it brings up the argument once again for a Jewish home state, which will eventually be created in 1948 in the Middle East. But for the United States itself, I think it has a profound psychological effect. You might remember during the First World War, this is only the 30th time I've said that Woodrow Wilson fights a war to make the world safe for democracy. And we see that kind of language creep into how Americans describe the Second World War. Even before the Holocaust was discovered by the American military, Dwight David Eisenhower, on the eve of the American invasion of Europe, caused the liberation of Europe a crusade. And what happens is that after the Holocaust, the United States starts to take steps to practice what it preaches. During the Second World War and afterwards, the United States kind of positions itself as the defender of freedom and human rights, and at least the guarantor that nothing like this could ever happen again in human history. And what kind of happens is, this creates a little bit of awkwardness, because if you as a country, or if a country is supposed to protect liberty, freedom, human rights, and all that, well, what does this mean for African Americans? When the Cold War starts, the United States loved kind of ripping on the Soviet Union for for the fact that it didn't grant people freedom, But whenever the United States would criticize the Soviet Union on human rights, the Soviets would always respond with propaganda like this. How can you lecture us on human rights when you have widespread lynchings in the United States? This is actually a Soviet propaganda poster of the Statue of Liberty lynching an African American. And the thing is that it's during the Cold War when the United States starts seeing itself as the guarantor of human freedom and human rights. And those criticisms, those attacks, they start to hit pretty hard. And so it's maybe not a coincidence that after the Second World War and during the Cold War, we see the emergence of the Civil Rights era. And by the way, the Civil Rights era, like we talked about, it's not as if there's a slow but steady buildup after the Second World War. I mean, it happens very, very quickly after the war ends. So let's also talk about kind of the general uh, overall legacy of America's mobilization during the Second World War. And it's one of those things that you just can't overemphasize. Um, the United States enters the war depressed economically and literally, unsure of itself, and ends the war as the richest country in the history of humanity. National income more than doubles. It goes from $81 billion in 1940 to $181 billion in 1945. And that wealth does trickle down to ordinary Americans. Per capita income, in other words, the amount of money an average person makes in the United States, doubles during the course of World War II. And if you look at the 1950s and 1960s, it was possible to live a middle class life as a blue collar worker. And in fact, more people were making middle class salaries and having middle class lives in the immediate aftermath of World War II than at any other point in American history. But before we get to that point, we have to end the war itself. And that's not going to be, whatever this chart tells you, an easy or a painless process. Till next time.